Hello everyone, I'm aReNGee and welcome to this week's tier list breakdown. This week's breakdown refers to to the tier list that was produced on September 22nd, the second tier list after we started moving to bi-weekly tier lists. And importantly, it covers the area about a week after patch 1.12. Before we get to the tier list itself, let's talk about patch 1.12. It contained only a single balance change, but one that had a profound impact on the metagame. The cost of Witching Hour would no longer be reduced by power. Now, as many of you longtime followers know, the Witching Hour was a key card in a deck that had the stranglehold on the metagame, Party Hour. Party Hour combined the powers of Scouting Party, Champion of Cunning, and Witching Hour in order to get a heavily discounted Witching Hour that it could combine with Champion of Cunning for a 2-card charge finish that could end games out of nowhere. With power no longer reducing Witching Hour's astonishing 24 power costs, it usually takes about 7, 8, even 9 more cards that you need to play in order to activate it, which slows down the combo considerably and makes the deck far more fragile. With this being the case, Party Hour decks have fallen down to tier 4 and are nearly out of the metagame completely, with just a single targeted nerf. This is relatively expected, as the deck itself had been warping the metagame quite heavily for nearly a month now, and many players were sick of playing against it. So it's not something unexpected, but it's certainly something that's had a profound impact on the game. Interestingly, a lot of the decks that had been doing well even with Party Hour have moved up the ladder, and a few new ones have started to pop up too. So without further ado, let's take a look at the list. Start there at the top. In tier 1 for the entirety of this tier list's existence is Combray Midrange. Combray midrange decks have changed a little bit. The majority of them have moved up the curve, or they're playing more 5 and 6 drops, and a whole lot of them are playing Harsh Rule nowadays, something that was laughable a couple patches ago. But they're good. They're very powerful. They're very popular decks, and there's a lot of different ways you can build them. So even if you're playing, a tier deck like Combray midrange, there's space for self-expression. Time and Justice have a lot of very good cards, so it's hard to go too far wrong when you're making your choices. Another deck that's been pretty popular and seems to have become the aggressive deck is Stonescar Jito. Despite only appearing with the last tier list, Stonescar Jito decks have really refined themselves into a killing machine, able of ending games very easily on turn 4 or 5. And if you don't have an early play or some mass removal, you're going to have a very difficult time surviving the Stonescar onslaught. With their incredible speed, they're able to undercut these Combray midrange decks, and are a large part of the reason, or they're at least part of the reason that these Combray decks are playing these harsh rules in order to catch back up, although I believe that is predominantly for the mirror. However, Stonescar Jito, it's fast. There's not a lot of storms right now, as players are experimenting with different decks rather than teching against one specific one, and it's very, very good at killing you quickly. The third deck on our tier list is another Combray deck, I'm afraid. There's a lot of old standbys on this list, specifically aggressive Combray. This deck can blend into midrange quite easily, especially a lower curve midrange deck, but it's distinguished by playing the 2-drops, usually Crownwatch Paladin and Awakened Student. They start off very aggressively, and they also play a bunch of equipment that regular Combray decks don't play, Vodakhan Staff and Gilded Glaive. Simply equipping a staff to an Awakened Student hits very hard very quickly and can end games in the similar style to Rakano. And with Aegis units, Stand Together, and if you really want to go that way, Copperhall Elite, they have a whole bunch of ways of throwing out resilient threats that are too large for Control to answer, and they attack fast enough that midrange has difficulty establishing themselves, as well as being able to go blow to blow with aggro. With all these powers combined, they're doing very well, and they are up in tier 1. Now, notably, on the previous tier list, aggressive Combray was combined with Tempo Combray as a similar archetype. However, in this one, they've split. Tempo Combray has fallen down to tier 2, as the cards that were very effective in the previous tier list, the Slow, the Teleport, the Praxis Displacer, are less effective on this one, as there's more low-to-the-ground aggro and creatureless control, and you're not quite as good against Combray as you used to be. So the tempo cards are pretty hit or miss, and the more focused aggressive strategy has been more successful in this particular metagame. Similar to the Combray strategy, Rakano Warcry is a deck that won't go away. Just like last patch, the strategy of putting weapons on an Aegis unit continues to be successful. The deck's fast enough to outrace any mid-range or control deck that doesn't have good answers to it. And if you're having trouble with aggressive decks, there's plenty of lifesteal options for you to swing the game back in your favor. Rakano decks are also never truly out, depending on what they play. They're only one good draw or one large Warcry unit away from turning the game back in their favor. Finally, at the bottom of Tier 1, we have the Stonescar Queen deck. While neither is popular nor as fast as the Jito version, they're still pretty effective, and they play a number of cards that are very effective in the current metagame, like Champion of Chaos. With their slower pace, they have a better chance of actually fighting aggro blow for blow, and enough removal to poke their way through mid-range. Although in terms of pure speed, they still have enough velocity in order to outpace control before Harsh Rule comes down. Overall, they're not so popular, which accounts for their lower status in Tier 1. However, if the Lightning Storms and Plagues start coming back up, they may become the preferred way in order to build aggressive Stonescar. Moving on to Tier 2, we have a favorite deck of mine, Stonescar Midrange, or Statuary Maiden Midrange, if you will, as that's the card that usually makes it tick. A unit and removal based midrange deck. The deck is quite powerful when it gets going and plays a lot of cards that are difficult for other strategies to deal with. A slew of deadly minions makes Aegis attackers not as effective, and its various flyers prevents you from getting around that too easily, as well as it has enough removal and silence effects in order to push through even Combray's mid-game strategies. However, it's not in Tier 1 because it has a lot of difficulty against a spread deck like Jito if it doesn't happen to run or draw Plague, and because of its mid-range curve, it has difficulty clocking the control opponents fast enough in order to close games out before their great cards come into play. So it's a powerful deck, but it's not quite good enough against everything in order to put it into Tier 1, and it's more of a metagame choice. They can fluctuate up or down depending on the exact composition of ladder at the moment. In second place in Tier 2, we have Alaysian Midrange, a deck that I'm kind of surprised to see so low. With Lightning Storm, Permafrost, and the best mid-range creatures around, you'd think that this would be able to thrive in a metagame based around go-wide decks and Combray. However, Alaysian Midrange has always had some trouble dealing with Rakano, as well as the aggressive Combray variants can outpace it, and most of its good cards are at some of their worst right now. Dawnwalker's no good, False Prince is no good, and Champion of Wisdom, your main draw to the archetype, or Champion of Wisdom is also not very effective in a World of Silence. Your main draw to the archetype remains Permafrost and Surso, but playing with only half a deck of good cards just isn't enough in the current metagame. The power is there, but it's just not quite flavor that Alaysian wants to see in order to truly dominate. Similarly, a very powerful list, but a slightly inconsistent one, is Felnscar. Felnscar is a Fire Primal Shadow deck, and it plays basically all the best cards in those colors. It plays Scouting Party, the Champions, you can play Statuary Maiden, Argentport Instigator, whatever you want, along with all the removal. Now, it's a very powerful deck that, even though it's only mid-range, the sheer power of its cards allow it to outpace control and grind out the mid-range wars on sheer value. However, it is an inconsistent one. If you draw the wrong cards with the wrong influence, you're not going to be able to cast anything in your deck whatsoever, and even just getting the wrong matchup of drawing all your single target removal against go wide, all your removal against control, something like that is enough to destabilize the ship, as it plays a variety of cards and sometimes plays some cards that are hit or miss like Sabotage to make the problem to exacerbate the problem even further. However, its power is undeniable, which places it in Tier 2. It's just not consistent enough for Tier 1 as of yet. Back on the list is Feln Midrange / Feln Control, a deck that's still finding out its identity. On previous patches, if you were going pure Feln, there was very little reason not to just go full Party Hour, and because of the power of the cards in Party Hour, it was difficult to distinguish any actual Feln lists from just Party Hour lists with less accelerants. However, on this patch, there's actual mid-range lists that some of them have taken the Party Hour flair of going with Scouting Party and Champion of Corruption. Cunning. I always call it Corruption, I'm not sure why. And others have gone the go tall route of going up to the 8 drops, be they Vera, Touch of the Umbran. Some players are experimenting with the Last Word. So there's a number of different ways to build this, and they're all somewhat effective. Felon's a deck that needs to find a good removal suite in order to really attack the metagame well, and with such a volatile metagame at the moment, it's difficult to find that. So the deck's still finding its identity, but look for it to do well moving forward. Next we have Temple Combre, a deck that I've already discussed about. The Temple cards aren't as effective as the pure aggressive ones, but the deck itself still has a fair amount of power and velocity, which allows it to be tier 2 but not highly placed. Finally, in the bottom of tier 2, we have the Mono Justice deck, a deck that some players like and some players aren't really a fan of. It plays the uninteractive game style of Suit Up Aegis that Rakano does, without any of the other cards in Rakano, basically. Instead of relying on Warcry and red units, it just goes for Paladin, Oathbook, and Mantle of Justice instead. Silverwing Familiar is a very annoying card to deal with if you don't have Aegis Poppers, and it rides that to victory, but unfortunately, it only has a singular game plan because it doesn't play removal very well at all, and it's essentially a racing deck. So if it doesn't draw the right cards, too many weapons, not enough units, too many units, not enough weapons, it has a lot of difficulty winning. So it's another powerful but inconsistent deck, and tier 2 is the place for it. In tier 3, making a somewhat triumphant comeback, we have the traditional Armory deck. With Party Hour, it's one of its worst matchups whatsoever going away. Traditional Armory has come back a bit. Combray up at the top, followed by Stonescar Jito, isn't what it wants to see. But Armory players, many of whom are diehard fans, are so relieved that they've been pushing the deck anyways. No major breakthroughs have been found as of yet, but the deck seems poised to rise in the coming weeks, and for the moment it's still tier 3. I don't advise it, as none of the tier 1 matchups, aside from Rakano, are really what you want to be facing. But if you can find the tech that makes it effective, maybe it's go wide, maybe it's go tall. I know Dude with Wit Bangs has been experimenting with a more spell-based version. I advise you to do so and play it, as the deck is very fun and I'm very happy to see it back. Following that, we have 3 different control lists. We have Time Justice Primal Control, formerly Cameraless, Fire Justice Primal Control, sometimes called Ikaria Blue, and 4 Faction Control, sometimes called the Last Deck. All these control lists are sort of down at the bottom here. Time Justice Primal Control looked poised to take over for a little bit, but players started experimenting with the other control lists, and there aren't too many dedicated Time Justice Primal pilots out there, so the innovation has stagnated a bit. As with any fresh metagame, and this certainly is a fresh metagame after the Party Hour summer that we experienced, if you will, control decks always have the most trouble adapting to the varied threats on the metagame. Aggro decks can play their linear strategy, but control decks by definition, not by definition, but these control decks play a more reactive game plan, and they need to have the correct answers for the questions that the aggro decks are posing. As the aggro decks can easily ask their questions in a vacuum, the control decks have a more difficult time selecting the correct answers at the beginning. I expect with more time, we'll see one or more of these decks rise up, but for the moment they're stuck in tier 3 until a good list can be found. Following them is Clockroaches, a deck that has seen some velocity lately. The best lists for Clockroaches have been found, but they're still wildly inconsistent and dependent on a crown of possibilities, leaving them, I'm afraid, in tier 3 until somebody comes up with a good way to make Celestial Omen cost 2 power, because really all the deck needs is 1 or 2 crowns in order to go off completely. And it is very good when it goes off. The problem is it doesn't always get there, and it doesn't usually play enough to survive the various aggressive decks while it dirtles around, unless you get very lucky and roll Lifesteal early on. Finally, in tier 3, we have Flight School, a deck that had a surge in popularity and effectiveness on the previous patches, due to its unexpectedly good matchup with Party Hour. With that deck gone, Flight School doesn't really have too much that it matches up that well with, so it's fallen back down to tier 3 as sort of a less powerful deck. Just in terms of the card quality, you'd be better off with a lot of the other decks in tier 2 and tier 1, and it hasn't distinguished itself with any particularly fantastic matchups against the tier 1 decks, relegating it sort of to the bottom of the pile. In Tier 4, as we've talked about, Party Hour decks are still playable, and you still see them sometimes on a ladder. But without the sheer power of the Witching Hour, they need to rely on Champion of Cunning and Scouting Party mostly to get the job done. And at that point, why aren't you just playing Fel mid-range? That's why they're down in Tier 4. The deck is going to need a total overhaul in order to become playable again, essentially. But it is still a deck that you can play. It's something that I'd like to see come back. Witching Hour is a fun card to play, not necessarily to play against, but I don't think that the combination of the three is something that we really wanted or that was healthy long term. So I'm not too upset that it's gone. Finally, in Tier 4, we have perennial Tier 5 deck Monofire Aggro. I've told you guys not to play this deck for a long time, but now I can tell you guys that this deck is not quite there yet. We had a player whose name I unfortunately forget. One moment. Synapses. Yes, Synapses Hitmaster playing exclusively Monofire from Gold, and was happy enough to share his achievement with us. And as such, as this is a proven master deck, I can no longer tell you that this is Tier 5 tier. I don't think that Monofire Aggro is exactly what you want to be doing, but it's been proven that players can get to master playing it, so I'm happy to announce that Monofire Aggro has moved up a tier. It is a playable deck. Congratulations to all you burn fanatics out there. You have finally made your first step towards legitimacy. So that has been the tier list for this week. It's been pretty interesting. We're in sort of a limbo period, as we're 1 week after a patch, after a metagame so heavily warped by Party Hour. We're just starting to relax and explore what's out there. We had 2 new decks join us this week, and 1 old deck in Fel midrange. And I'm excited to see what the next tier list brings as players sort of become more comfortable with what's going on right now and find the optimal list for the time. With that in mind, you'll see me doing more stock talks as the days go by. I'll be talking about probably aggressive Combrain next, I expect, and giving you guys an idea of what that would look like. And the next actual tier list will be released on October 6th. Until then, I wish you all the best, and I hope to see you guys all in my next video.